coming to this session. My name is Claire Solomon. I'm on the steering committee for Counterfire, and I'm very pleased to be chairing this discussion and debate on the question of the EU referendum, which is coming up on the 23rd of June. As you may have seen, there are events going on across the country under the banner of #Lexit, why the left should campaign for a left exit from the European Union, and it gives me great pleasure really to introduce our speaker for today. We have the fantastic Tariq Ali, who's a writer, a journalist, and has been involved in campaigns for many years. He's going to be speaking for about 25 minutes or so, and then we will open up to the floor for questions, contributions, discussions, disagreements, and so on. And Tariq will come back and answer some questions as well. So without further ado, I will bring in Tariq, and I'll come back to you in about 25 minutes. Thanks very much, Tariq.
Okay. Dear friends, if we look at the European Union simply from the vantage point of where we are, i.e. London, the capital of the United Kingdom, virtually the entire political elite is for Remain. If you look at the newspapers, all the financial press, The Economist, the Financial Times, the liberal dailies, The Guardian, The Independent, The Mirror, are for remaining. The Murdoch press is slightly skeptical, but ultimately in favor of remaining. So there's a situation which is unbalanced. And the fear campaign that is on now does remind one of the campaign waged against the Scottish right to independence, which for the last 2 to 3 weeks was totally dominated by fear. And it's exactly the same tactic that is being followed on this occasion. I mean, it's difficult to open a newspaper without reading some fear campaign story. If Britain leaves, disaster will happen economically, disaster will happen on this front, on that front, and on every other front possible. So let's just try and see what is at stake in this referendum. I look at the referendum not exclusively from the point of view of what is in the interests of the United Kingdom and its majority population at the present time. It's wrong to just look at it from that point of view. I think if you look at the referendum from the point of view of what is happening in Europe as a whole and what Europe needs, then what is otherwise and should be a tactical issue for the left, should we stay in or stay out, there's no huge principle involved, there's no big principle at stake, except that tactically now, given what the European Union has been doing since 2008 in particular, it becomes absolutely crucial to deliver, if we can, a huge kick in Europe's backside, on it, hard, to provoke a British exit and to open up a debate within Europe itself as to what future it should have, the direction in which it is going. I don't have much respect for the Remain campaign. I don't have any respect for the conservative-dominated Brexit campaign. It's a fight within the Conservative Party. And the notion that Boris Johnson is somehow evil personified and Cameron is good is something that I find not just distasteful, but a complete falsehood. I mean, we are living in a, we have just experienced one of the most vicious racist Islamophobic campaigns against the guy who's been elected mayor of London, Sadiq Khan. Just vicious. Who waged this campaign? The campaign was waged by the Conservative Party as a whole, led by Cameron and Zach Goldsmith, We now know there were big clashes between Goldsmith and the party leadership, and they told him, this is the way we're going to fight the campaign. Full stop. We don't care what you think. So they did it, and they lost. But how is this any worse than what, you know, Boris would have done? He participated in the same campaign on Cameron's side. So the notion that one side is utterly racist and the other side is just not even worth thinking about seriously. Corbyn was under huge pressure from both within the party to join Cameron and have a joint campaign. This he rejected, which of course is positive. His own position is not very good in my opinion, because had he come out against, it would have had a bigger impact, and we would then have had a real debate within the Labour movement as a whole, but he didn't do that. And his reasons for staying in are the same: change it from within. Now, this is a position which is put forward by some on the left. It's best to stay in and change it from within. Well, I ask, how do you intend to change it? How? We haven't had a single idea from these people as to how you're going to change Europe. Because as even some of those who are in favor of staying in say, it is impossible to democratize the institution as is presently constituted. How are you going to do it? No answers at all. There are possibilities, but they haven't come up with them. And those possibilities require a new constitution for the European Union, massive democratization on local and regional levels as well as national levels, an economy which is not tied to the neoliberal model of the Washington Consensus. But no one has come up with that. I mean, we're waiting to hear how a new Europe is possible. Nothing. When I asked Varoufakis and his gang, I said, have you even got a team of experts together from your side who want to change Europe from within to at least write an alternative constitution for the EU? No. Why? Not time enough. Well, then what's the point of waging this sort of wishy-washy campaign if you haven't got any alternative? Who knows, they might have convinced me or some of us here, I have no idea. But given that there's absolutely nothing, otherwise, and it just becomes sentimental. People just saying what they feel without much thought going into it. I mean, my dear friend Noam Chomsky has come out against Brexit on extremely narrow grounds that the right, or the racist right, is supporting it. Well, the racist right, as I've explained, is also against coming out. So that doesn't get you very far. Ken Loach, who's made this wonderful movie, is also in favor of fighting from within. It's you know, not a serious argument unless we are told and given an alternative. Otherwise, we can say it about everything. Another world is possible, another Europe is possible, another Asia is possible. Yes, they're all possible. But how do you get there? Is there a bridge to that possibility? Is there even a narrow path to that bridge? So far, no. So, it's difficult sometimes to argue the case, but I think we have to argue it, that on every single level, the changes in the structure of the European Union and what it stands for are obvious. If previously we used to think that, okay, economically Europe comes out, mouths platitudes like we're all for economic stability, this, that, and the other, it doesn't matter. Because politically we can do what we want. Now we have the politics and economics of Europe like this, totally bound with each other. And if you look at it now on virtually any level, starting with the economy, the economic prohibitions of the European Union, and this is before the TTIP has even been made public, are such that Corbyn would not be able to implement even the mildest radical things in his manifesto. Renationalize the railways, not allowed by the European Union laws at the moment, not allowed. And even those working for Corbyn and John McDonnell admit this, saying that as present constituted, none of our policy prescriptions would go through. But then we would fight for a different Europe when we came to power. Forget it if you're not fighting now, educating people regardless of whether we win or we lose. So economically, it is a machine for neoliberal capitalism. And that is what it pushes. Add to that, and we have clear-cut examples of that. We've seen what they did to Greece, completely brutalized and wrecked a country which was merely demanding 50% sovereignty to save the living conditions of its people. Rejected. Either you do what we want, go down on your knees before us, or we will destroy you. This is what the Greek leadership was told time and time again. Unfortunately, having appealed to their own people and won the right to take on the Troika and the EU, the Greek leadership at a crucial point capitulated. No other word for it, the great capitulation. As a result, Syriza will be wiped out in the next elections, believe you me. Virtually the entire party membership, has left. What remains are full-time apparatchiks, members of parliament, people employed by the government in some capacity or the other. All the activists who won the referendum, won the election, are out of that party. If you look at Ireland and Portugal, what is happening there? Neoliberal measures are driving young people out of the country. 1 in 4 of young people in Ireland have been leaving. This is the Irish way, migrate, migrate, avoid the crisis. And they've been migrating to North America, very few here, because here the unemployment figures are concealed but are quite high, going to Australia, going to the English-speaking world. In Portugal, 500,000 young people have left the country over the last 4 to 5 years and going to as far away places as Brazil and Angola to find work. So that's why I stress that when I talk about voting to get out of the European Union, to punish the European Union, it's not just for the sake of British workers. It's for the sake of European workers as well. That is an important thing to realize, which I don't hear any of these people talking, the so-called Europeans. Where do they even talk about Europe? How often is Europe and European countries and their problems being covered in The Guardian? To take but one example. France is erupting even as we are gathered here. Hundreds of thousands of workers, students, others on the streets. What is the coverage here of these so-called pro-Europeans? They're not showing it to us. They're not telling us what's going on in France, because that might change the mood. They couldn't hide the fact that Austria came within a whisker of electing a fascist as their president. Literally a whisker. Austria was saved by a halfway decent independent Green who came second, showing the polarization taking place. And the Conservative and Social Democrats had to vote for the Green to keep the fascist out, which they did. But it could have gone the other way. And it's not that the president has powers or no powers in Austria. That's irrelevant. The symbolism of this guy being elected president of Austria was there for all of us to see. And now, who is responsible for this? Surely all these countries facing these crises, Spain politically paralyzed, Portugal, Ireland and Greece effectively European Union colonies, not allowed to do anything without consulting Brussels or Berlin. That's what's going on. And we are told that all is well with Europe and that Farage and Boris Johnson combined will make things much worse. But how much more worse can these things get? How much? What are we to expect? We know what's happening in Europe. We know that parts of Britain are in a mess. So we have a parochial campaign being fought in Britain and an even more parochial one in Scotland, which looks simply from the vantage point of Scotland. Well, you can tell the Scottish comrades that a small country in Europe, in the European Union as constructed at the moment, will be crushed. Just see what they're doing to the others. And even the mildest measures being proposed by the SNP wouldn't be allowed. So there is a lot to fight for in the weeks ahead. What is the situation generally then in the patterns, say, of relations between rulers and ruled in Europe? The European Union makes it virtually impossible for those who are ruled to challenge the rulers. So democracy itself is increasingly truncated, increasingly hollowed out, both on a European level and on the level of national parliaments. That is a direct result of the policies that the European Union has been forcing down the throats of people since the defeats they suffered at the constitutional referendum some years ago. That is what is going on. And people are blissfully unaware of these things because they are never reported. And Europe is never seriously discussed in this country, except from who do you prefer to be ruled by, Boris Johnson or David Cameron? With the Blairites saying, let's have a bloc with Cameron. And when Corbyn correctly refuses to do that, they get in David Miliband to do a walk with Cameron on the steps of the British Museum after giving some bogus lecture. And then Ed Balls is imported back. I don't know which part of the States he is in at the moment, but he's imported back for a photo opportunity with Osborne wearing overalls and helmets to show we're with the workers. Thank you very much. So in this situation, if you look at it from the point of view of democracy, it's becoming a disastrous situation. If you look at it from the point of view of interstate relations, what do we see? In '57, when the European Union was set up, though the Americans, of course, approved it because they wanted something big to sort of safeguard Western Europe from the Russian threat, so-called, there was still within the European Union, minus Britain, a goalist feeling that perhaps Europe could become a third force between the Soviet bloc and the NATO American bloc. That was certainly de Gaulle's view, because after Suez, when Europe was told brutally, you have no right to behave like this without consulting us, and the American President Eisenhower rang and abused, literally abused Harold Macmillan and Anthony Eden for what they had done in Egypt, because they hadn't asked for American permission to invade Egypt. They'd gone unilaterally with France and Israel to do it, and the Americans said, never again. And so the French said, who are they to tell us what to do? Let's have a Europe where we can do what we want to do. Against their interests if necessary, but in our interests. The Americans said no, and gradually, with the entry of Britain into the European Union, the American position got carried. I mean, that is why the Americans were so keen to have Britain inside the European Union. But then at least you had Germany, which did the economy, and France that did the politics. And so there was some distance. And there was some mutuality between the big countries in Europe. Today the Germans are totally dominant since the reunification. It is economically and politically the single most important state in the European Union, and that's why it dominates. It's got nothing to do with the Second World War. It's got everything to do with the post-war structures that were established. Any state that size within the European Union would be dominant, given what's happening to the other states. Look at the state of France in crisis and now moving very strongly towards Atlanticism. Italy used to back France, no longer. It's more skeptical now of Europe. The Benelux countries used to back Germany, but they now back Germany, and Germany also has parts of Central Europe. I remember being in Berlin at the time of the early years of the Iraq War, where I was debating some American, person of authority. I've forgotten her name, but and the head of the German Foreign Office came up to me and said, "Thank you for what you said. This invasion and occupation of Iraq has been a total disaster." And I said, "Well, yes, we know that, but I said, what about countries closely allied to you, which you control economically, countries like Poland and other Eastern European countries? I mean, they've been sending troops to Iraq." And he said, "Herr Ali, please give us a little bit of time." They won't do it easily the next time. In other words, they were very conscious of the role they were going to play in Eastern Europe, Central Europe, and now, of course, in Europe as a whole. And the German banks lend the money, so the German banks maintain the right to call for it back. That is what is going on, effectively, in relations to Greece, etc. And the third thing, so interstate relations, no equality, basically German domination. Political relations, huge divide between the ordinary people and the governments. When this divide takes place on the streets, it's usually run by the left. When it takes place at the ballot box, it often returns extreme right-wing, not majorities, but large votes for right and extreme right-wing parties. This is happening all over Europe today, including Germany. So Farage, to be perfectly frank with you, is partially a buffoon, but he's by no means as nasty or as unpleasant as the FN, the Front National in France, who certainly, I mean, they've made cosmetic changes, but in terms of their philosophy, it is deeply rooted in extreme right-wing semi-fascist thought. The Greeks, the Golden Dawn, I won't even talk about because they don't even try and hide it. They are fascists. Germany, the new party for Germany, which won 10% of the vote, more than the left party, is another case in point. That is a traditional extreme right conservative party winning over people from both the center-left and the center-right. So it's a mess. Effectively, Europe is in a complete mess today, and why should we, on the left in Britain, given the opportunity, back this mess? I'm not saying that voting against it or pulling out will automatically lead to good things. Of course, how can we predict that? We don't have the power to influence that. But it will certainly create a very different debate than the one that is taking place now. And then the big hypocrisy that Cameron is somehow better on immigration than Boris and Farage. I mean, what world do people live in, for God's sake? I mean, just look at the camp in Calais and look at the threat of Hollande just to help Cameron out. If Britain leaves Europe, we will send all the refugees in Calais from the jungle, as it's so called, to Britain the next day. Well, fine, good, send them. This This is meant to be a threat to help Remain win votes. And the refugees, the instinctive response of Merkel, denounced by her own party, change of line, big reaction in Germany against that, and what happens? Europe is not going to take refugees anymore. Refugees created by wars that it supports in most cases. That is what creates the refugees. And as everyone knows or should know, people don't like leaving their homes. But when they have no homes left because they've been bombed and destroyed in a huge civil war, which as we now know was largely provoked by the United States and its allies, who wanted another regime change. Not being satisfied by the mess they created in Libya, they wanted to repeat it in Syria. They are repeating it in the Yemen via the Saudis. And then where do the refugees go? You bomb those countries, then be prepared to take refugees and tell your people in different European countries, if we go to war, that will mean at least 500,000 refugees per European country. Okay, let's do that. Let's do that. Why don't they do that? Instead, they are now engaged in a squalid, sordid deal, giving money to the Turkish government to take the refugees which Europe had promised to take, 6 billion or something. And in return for that, hardly any criticism of Recep Erdogan's government in Turkey for the oppression against Turkish people, Turkish Kurdish people, oppositionists inside Turkey itself, with newspapers under attack, liberal journalists being locked up and accused of, something or the other. No mention, no consistent attack on this in the British media. And in return, the Turks have been promised, we'll give you free visa, you won't need visas to come and visit Europe. As if this is going to go through. Britain is going to agree to that? No. France? No. Germany even? I doubt it very much. The Eastern Europeans have already said no. I mean, Turkey was once being considered for membership, now they're being considered for free visas, but they won't even get that. And Erdogan talks like the Bazari shopkeeper he is to his people, saying they're offering us so many billions. I said, why not? Let's get some more money in. He's open about it. You watch him on television. He says, I've made up my mind. I thought maybe I should ask for 1 billion more. Then I said, well, let's take this. What do you think? And if you say, yeah, you were right, maybe we can get some more later. And there are already 3 million Syrian refugees in Turkey begging on the streets in most parts of that country. But this is the Europe we're looking at. And in order to change this Europe, the first step, I think, has to be to vote out in the referendum. And of course, our out has nothing to do with the fight inside the Conservative Party. And I hate this talk, oh, so you're with Farage, so what should we say? So you're with Cameron. I mean, it's a pointless debating on that level. It's utterly debasing. There are more serious political issues involved, and that is what we should be thinking about. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Tariq. And Tariq will be coming back to answer questions and other bits of discussion in a moment. So I'm going to take some people from the floor to start with. If you could tell us your name and where you come from, if you want to.
I'm Ellen.
Do you want to stand up? Oh, actually, do we have a roving mic? Fran's got it. Lovely, thanks, Fran.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. My name is Ellen. Is this working? Yeah. My name is Ellen. I'm a member of Counterfire. I'd like to know what's the worst we can fear if we leave Europe, because I think whatever happens is pretty scary. Maybe I'm asking you to look at a crystal ball, but why not?
we're going to have to share a pen. Can I have a bit of paper up here?
Can someone lend us a pen?
Oh no, I'm not doing that.
Do you want a pen?
Okay, so I've now got Kevin. Thank you.
My name's Kevin Ovenden. I'm a writer and journalist, not quite as venerable as Tariq yet. Tariq gave us an analysis, then strategy and tactics, and I think that's important because too often in this debate people start the other way round and look at tactics and park the analysis and the strategy. The great Chinese military thinker Sun Tzu said, "Tactics without strategy is the noise before defeat." And that's not a good way for the left to go. And in looking at the analysis, it's important, I think, to be very concrete about what's happening around Europe. I flew in here last night from Athens, from Greece. The world's media, which was parked in St Agnes Square this time last year, has departed Greece. The Troika has not departed Greece, and the crisis has not departed Greece. On Sunday just gone, the Greek Parliament passed the final set, they're not the final actually, but the latest set of measures under the third memorandum. One of those measures is what's called the koftis, or the guillotine. What it means is this, is that a huge number of austerity measures will automatically come in at any point in the next couple of years, without any votes, without any Greek person deciding, but on the say, where if the Troika says you've missed the targets, then the thing will come in. It's like being on a permanent management review with the threat of the sack at the end of every month. That is the truncating of democracy in Greece. And the austerity across Europe is intersecting with the refugee crisis for this reason. Every year in Germany, 100,000 more people die than are born. Similarly, in other parts of Europe, the north of England is depopulating. If we are to have growth and prosperity, we need people to come to Europe. But austerity Europe, which is built into the EU and into the European Central Bank, is killing growth. Austerity capitalism kills growth, therefore the capitalist governments are killing the refugees in the Aegean and the southern Mediterranean. And if people talk about freedom of movement, just two quick things. I flew from Athens to Berlin a couple of weeks ago, within the Schengen zone, passport free, all very modern. It doesn't exist, friends. It doesn't exist. Not if you have my colour skin or Tariq's or some of ours here and you're travelling from Greece. It was easier to get into the United States with a passport with 23 Arab stamps in it than it was to get into Tegelhof Airport travelling from Athens. But that's not the main thing that's happening around migration. The main thing that's happening is the closure of the frontiers of Europe and the death of thousands of human beings in the southern Mediterranean and in the Aegean. And the very final thing I want to say is that Tariq said there are tactical questions. That's true, but I think one big thing is at stake on this question over the whole of Europe, and that is what kind of labour movement and left do we want? Two poles have emerged. The TUC in Britain and the CGT in France. The TUC in Britain has its name associated with the CBI, NATO, the Governor of the Bank of England, Uncle Tom Cobley and reactionary all for the Remain vote, because that's the logic of the Remain position. The CGT is conducting one of the biggest class confrontations in Europe, which is against the French government and also against the EU, because the EU stands behind the French government. So the path is this: internationalist, resistance and steer left, or a capitulation behind the centre which is swallowing us in Europe into barbarism.
Thank you, Kevin. I've actually had loads of hands on this topic, so I'm going to tap on the microphone when you've got 30 seconds left. Next person is Rob. You can still introduce yourself.
Sorry, my name's Rob. I'm a member of RS21, though kind of just speaking for myself. And I think both Tariq and Kevin have destroyed a case for Remain. I think it's unplausible for to make an argument that's revolutionary, so you can seriously get behind a body as neoliberal and racist as the European Union. But I do think that we also need to take Tariq's analogy, is there a path to Lexit? So that you can quite plausibly say there's no conceivable path to reforming the EU. But I think we also need to think about, in terms of the left exit that comrades are talking about, is there a viable path on offer? And comparisons have been made to the Scottish referendum, but I do think to think in those terms, we think both who is scrabbling with their hand on the lever. We have two equally reactionary, equally austerity committed It's groups within the Tory party, the British parliamentary right, scrabbling to make either a vision of British Remain or Brexit, and we don't have neither the ability to grab hold of the lever ourselves, nor to plausibly build a mass campaign that can build the pressure for the sort of Lexit that we would like to see. Which means what we're plausibly talking about in terms of a vote is not just a propaganda campaign around the nature of the EU, the nature that we'd have to break from it, but actually what would the reality of a Brexit under these conditions be? I think a Brexit delivered by a crisis of the right, a Brexit delivered by a campaign that's based itself on a popular dog whistle campaign, not just around immigration, but around economic migration and economic migrants' rights in specific, would be an incredibly dangerous thing. If Brexit were to win, we're not going to see mass deportations of economic migrants, but we will see a growth in confidence, both for the most openly reactionary elements of the Tory party, but more significantly for their popular base within society, the popular base which the Brexit campaign is built around, trying to mobilise in opposition to kind of the more post-Blairite, socially conservative establishment. I think what would that mean in terms of a popular debate? It means that if we're having a debate around Lexit, too often we're talking in small circles to the far left and missing the broader picture, which is the debate happening at the moment in British society, which is not a debate around breaking Britain's debt relations with Germany or Spain, debt relations that both countries would leave intact. Whether Britain is inside the European Union, pissing in from the outside, or slightly outside, pissing in from the slightly further outside, the British government is still one of the most committed to neoliberalism within Europe, still committed to the austerity measures in Greece, more significantly to the austerity measures in Spain and Ireland, where British banks have a much larger exposure to Spanish and Irish debt. The one question where we will see movement is over the rights of EU citizens within this country. And I think those who say that Britain is dependent on EU migrant labour are right. But to draw a parallel with the situation of, say, Jamaican teachers and teaching at the moment, who have been brought over in large numbers because of the crisis in teaching. They've been brought over, but they've been brought over without any rights. Economic factors draw them here, but I was involved in a campaign to defend Jamaican teachers who'd found themselves falling foul of educational policies they weren't familiar with. And when people lost their jobs, they were left without recourse to benefits, without recourse to housing, were left in an incredibly difficult, precarious social situation. So I think one of the key arguments that the left needs to fight going forward is, yes, a propaganda campaign around what Lexit would mean, a propaganda campaign around the nature of the EU as a capitalist institution on a par with the IMF and the World Bank, but also a key social argument within British society about the need for solidarity with migrants and significantly, sorry Pat, I can see you, significantly the need to build solidarity in terms of the strikes and things for which they are a vital part of the British workforce.
Thank you. Just behind you, actually, Sophie.
Sophie Mason. I just have a very short question.
Take the microphone in, because people at the back.
Oh, God. Very short question. If Corbyn were to be elected on a radical manifesto, you said that the EU would not allow the nationalisation of the railways and things like that. Could you explain that? I just don't understand. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Sophie. Do you want to come back on some of those now, Tariq, or do you want to take a few more? Take a few more. Got Penny next, at the back, on the left, off the right section. Definitely on the left.
Okay, so this is probably incredibly simplistic, but that is where I am in this discussion. If we vote to remain, we will continue to see the horrendous videos of boats capsizing, people disappearing into the sea, and I can't see any prospect from any of the people in the Remain campaign about how that might change. If we vote to leave, when you talked about the explosion that could happen, a festival of the right, maybe, but up to us is to create the ground that destabilisation for Cameron and the rest, if we vote to leave, is ground in which we are very good and very well organised at fighting. And I'm going to make an unashamed plug here for the convoy to Calais on June the 18th, because the People's Assembly is one of many partners that are going to Calais on the 18th of June. And we don't have in the People's Assembly a position on leave or remain. We're full of people with all different views. But what we unite around is trying to get some kind of big, huge national opposition to what is happening with refugees. We had a good demonstration in March in London, but what we need now is something that specifically shines the spotlight on Calais, and nearly everybody who has come into individual contact by small delegations going over sporadically throughout the year to come together, to bring unions together, to bring Stand Up to Racism together, to bring Momentum together, to bring it all together on that issue just before the vote. It gives me the best hope that we can create the ground, because I personally would vote to leave, that the destabilisation that would cause would put things more on our side and would do something to stop what's happening in Calais and stop what's happening throughout the rest of Europe, because it's just simply inhumane. Now, I'm aware that may be a simplistic view, but that's where I am anyway.
Thank you, Penny from Manchester. Just in front of you, the guy here with Yabasta t-shirt on.
Okay, so I'll start by saying I'm a dreamer, an internationalist and a Marxist, and I absolutely despair at what Mr. Tariq Ali is saying and the revolutionary left. I believe that Europe is a positive movement. I believe that Europe is not just about neoliberalism, it's about bringing people together from different cultures and backgrounds. I believe that the fascist movement you've seen across Europe are a response to austerity, which is nothing to do with the European project. It's an international capitalist austerity movement. In terms of the European Union and the advantages of being in the European Union, we're facing global climate change. We've got a finance system which is out of control. The very people that are pushing the austerity and the right-wing messages is the UK government and the City of London. If we was more engaged in Europe and regulated the financial system, we would actually be moving much more positively in a socialist way. I am a revolutionary, but I believe in revolutionary on an international basis. I actually feel that a lot of the words I'm hearing from the left come down to a move backwards. I do feel nationalism in some of the words that are coming across, and that scares me, and that's just how I feel.
Over this side, Chris, please, and then just behind you, Alistair.
The driving force for neoliberalism in Europe is not the Cameron government. The Cameron government is not the most right-wing government in Europe. For God's sake, there is a lot of competition for that now. This is not Margaret Thatcher in the 1980s. There are now neoliberal right-wing governments, including fascists, across Europe. Let's forget this stuff. Secondly, the driving force of racism in Europe is not Nigel Farage. He's a bit player. It is the European Union which is creating this situation. And I think we need to look at it. And I agree with I'm Chris Banbury, I'm a supporter of the Rise Coalition in Scotland. I agree with your remarks about Scotland, but what I want to address is this question of Brexit. What would happen if there was a vote to leave the European Union in Britain? Cameron and Osborne would be toast. Right? Johnson and Gove would probably one and take the leadership. But take the leadership of what? A Conservative Party which would be divided down the middle, at civil war, a government which has to spend its time negotiating exiting the European Union with a constitutional crisis in Scotland. Would this be a hard right-wing government driving austerity? No, it wouldn't. We haven't got one now. Actually, it's a government we've got now, making U-turns all the time over the junior doctors, the academisation of schools, etc., etc. If we could not make capital of that situation, we are not worth a pinch of salt. And secondly, what would happen if it was a narrow win for Cameron? He's toast. He's going to go in a year. He said that. Who's going to succeed him? On the Tory backbenches, Osborne is treated with ridicule because he's not driven down the deficit and he's done nothing about UK productivity. He's toast. Who would they put in? Theresa May? I mean, you'd be talking again about a weak Tory government with the European sceptic backbenchers, and this would then be like Scotland, not accepting this decision, not saying that's the European issue done and dusted. They'd be going for it again. They are bitter already about Project Fear. It's bizarre to have Tory MPs, prominent ones, coming up to you and say, you were right about what happened in Scotland. These people are playing Project Fear. There'd be civil war in the Conservative Party. The only way you would get a strong right-wing government in Britain committed to austerity is if Cameron won this referendum by 60%. Then you would have a Conservative government which would feel emboldened to do it. The outcomes coming out most likely is it will be a narrow referendum result. Either way, we are in a position to benefit from it. It's not the main reason why you should vote to quit the European Union. Tarik's reasons are the right ones. But if we cannot benefit from divisions in the right and a weak Tory government, then as I say, we're not without a pinch of our salt. Boris Johnson is a buffoon. Imagine how he'd play in Scotland post-referendum. Imagine trying to drive it through and negotiate with Europe. A Johnson government actually would be a weak government, and we could deal with it.
The EU is an imperial construction. Not all empires look like Rome, and Berlin is not the new Rome. They look in different kinds of ways. Roman Empire is one, but there's also the British Empire, which wasn't just India, it was the pillar of the empire, but the British Empire was also Australia, South Africa, and Australia, independent capitalist states with their own interests. The EU is like that in many ways. It's a hierarchical construction of states, with some at the top, others further down, and some at the bottom. Greece is obviously very much at the bottom, Germany is very much at the top. But it is also a mechanism for the implementation of a common set of economic policies across the continent, mostly being driven not by the City of London, but by the EU itself and the ECB. So it's implementation of these neoliberal across the continent, for the ordering of the relations between these states and other blocks of capital, America, China, Russia, and other places. And increasingly, we must not forget, also a relationship that is military as well. It's also an expansionary bloc that is increasingly forcing wars and conflicts on its borders, as it has done in the Balkans and it has done in Russia. We must not forget that the EU is the cornerstone of NATO. Now, there have always been socialists in the past who actually defended empires. If we roll back 100 years, there will be people that defended the British Empire in the British Labour movement in exactly the same terms which people defending the EU today. That it's about brotherly love, bringing people together, creating common links, and that was nonsense then. Equally, there are people in, probably slightly more obscure historical reference, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, who thought under the, which took up most of the Balkans, but were dominated by German and Hungarian speakers, who said that, this was a great internationalist project. All we needed to do was tweak it. Under the Habsburgs, we can create brotherly love. If not, all hell will break loose. They were wrong, they were wrong, they were wrong. As when the Russian socialists took over the Russian Empire and then fell in love with that after the Russian Revolution and decided they wanted to keep the other bits. They were wrong, they were always wrong. There's nothing progressive about empires. Empires are exploitative and oppressive. History can only advance when they are dismantled. Just as the British Empire had to be dismantled, the Russian Empire had to be dismantled, and long, long ago the Roman Empire had to be dismantled. The EU is nascent, but it is a construction like that. It's increasingly militarized. It is about exploiting and oppressing the peoples of Europe and enforcing neoliberalism. We need to dismantle this construction that they are building before it goes any further.
Thank you. And over this side, Fran. Thank you. We've got Jan.
I think we have to be kind of realistic about that. And I think really, when you look at what's happening in France, what we really need to do is put our faith a little bit more in street movements, in movements where people are actually rising up against the government. I don't think we should rely on governments to change things radically for us, because that's never going to happen, in my opinion. And I think maybe if people throughout Europe had supported Syriza in a much more obvious fashion on the streets everywhere across Europe, there might have been a slightly different, I might be being naive, but I think there might have been a different outcome of that. And I think that the left and other progressive forces should be joining together very much to make our voices heard really obviously by doing what they're doing in France right now. I just don't think that there's any other solution really. I think we can't put our faith in governments that inevitably are going to be neoliberal, whatever sort of shade of that is. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Over to Lindsay in the middle. And then we've got two more at the back here afterwards.
In terms of the question that Jan just raised about solidarity, I think everybody can agree with that, both in terms of the strikes, in terms of Syriza, although one of the problems of solidarity with Syriza was the policy that it adopted when it came to confronting or not confronting the demands of the Troika and all those sorts of things. And also the convoy was very deliberately, we chose deliberately to launch the convoy during the referendum campaign, precisely to raise an alternative to the scapegoating of Muslims and all of those things. Now, I obviously, you can do that whether you're in or out of the EU. But I think the point about the EU is it's not just like, you know, when you say, well, there's different, all governments are neoliberal to one extent or another. The EU is driving a policy of neoliberalism and enforcing it on its constituent members. It's driving a militaristic policy. We don't really hear that much about this, but it is now inextricably bound up with NATO and with being involved in those things. So I think for those reasons, and of course the whole refugee crisis, they used to have the policy of Mare Nostrum, which is they would rescue people from the sea. The EU abandoned that policy deliberately to allow people to drown because they thought they would be too attracted in coming to Europe otherwise. That is the honest truth that, that was put. So I think all those things make it a very strong case against. I also feel that we are facing a situation. I went to a meeting the other week where somebody who works, who's an activist in one of the rail unions, said everybody he speaks to is saying they're going to vote Leave. Right? I think millions of Labour voters and Labour supporters are going to vote Leave. Now, there's two ways you can handle this. Unfortunately, Labour took the decision of supporting the Remain campaign, and actually Harriet Harman was in Asda with David Cameron last week as well. Obviously, against what Jeremy Corbyn wants to do, who's making quite a good fist of it from a bad position. You know, he's trying to stress TTIP and all that kind of thing. But the honest truth is Labour has abandoned those people. What they'll do is turn around and say, these are people who support UKIP. In other words, they'll say the Labour people are doing it for racist reasons. In my experience, that is simply not true. That people understand this is a neoliberal project. They understand it is profoundly undemocratic, and they understand that they don't have any control over their lives when the EU is controlling all these things. It seems to me that is the issue. And I think really the Left Remain campaign, you know, we agree with everything you say, but we have to stay in because of Boris Johnson. It's just ridiculous. And I would also add one other thing. You never hear them criticising the rubbish that is coming out about the figures that come out every day. You never hear them saying, you know, distancing themselves from the main Remain campaign. They don't do it. They keep quiet about all these things and whisper privately on the left that really we agree with you all, but we can't let this happen. I think that is a scandalous abdication of responsibility on the left, and we have to put an alternative.
Thank you, Lindsay. And then two really final points. The guy with his hand up, first of all, and the guy next to him. I can't quite see your faces. Yeah, he just had his hand up there. That's the one. Yeah. And then
James Murray, from legal aid lawyer from Liverpool. I agree with everything that Tariq says. This is a ridiculous situation where this country is being attached to a non-democratic institution, and I believe, as a democratic socialist, I would say the essence is democracy. We could in fact pack the whole of the EU Parliament with Jeremy Corbyn lookalikes. We could have all of that and nothing would change in the EU, because all the power is not with the elected representative, it's not with the Parliament, not at all. It is an amending institution. All the power is with the civil servants, is with the commissioners, is with the commission. There's not one elected person there. It's a complete gravy train, and that's the establishment, and it's the establishment writ large for on the basis of its 500 million instead of 60 million pounds worth of establishment.
30 seconds.
It is beholden upon everybody on the left to vote out in order, exactly as Tariq says, to give them a kick up the arse.
Thank you. Yeah, Dan, yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to come back on the guy who said he detected an undercurrent of nationalism in the room or something, because I genuinely haven't detected an undercurrent of nationalism in the room. And I think, following on from what Lindsay said as well, if you say that, you do, you know, we all know what we think, but there'll be people out there who instinctively dislike the EU, who you push towards nationalism, who you push towards UKIP, who Labour don't capture the votes of. And I think we have to be able to say supranational institutions composed of national governments are not some anti-national force, right? And the way that you defeat your enemy, the way the street movements win, is by breaking apart your enemy, is by driving your enemy into a crisis. If we want to defeat the Troika that are doing what they're doing to Greece, that means defeating the EU. That means Britain voting to leave the EU, or at least throwing it into crisis by coming close to voting. And actually, it's not true that the Remain camp is anti-nationalist. Right? Britain's stronger in Europe. History shows the stronger Britain is, the worse off the world is. I want a weaker British state. So if Britain's stronger in Europe, I will vote to leave the EU. And the history of Europe is, there isn't this European value that is some wonderful, more social democratic thing than anywhere else in the world. Maybe for the 50s, the 60s and the 70s. But before that, it was the centre of fascist dictatorships. Before that, it colonised the world. The idea that Europe is some nice thing, I just don't buy.
Thank you very much for all the fantastic discussion and debate. Just before I bring Tariq in to answer all of those questions in 10 to 15 minutes, I've got a couple of announcements for you. One is up on the 4th floor, we've got a wonderful photo exhibition by Jim Aindo, is that correct? So please go up there and look at the photos of the movement and everything that we've been involved in over the years. And we've also want to announce that on the 4th of June at Goldsmiths there is the Prevent conference. As you know, this is the Prevent strategy that the government have been pushing through to basically spy on Muslims, and it's called Prevent Islamophobia and Civil Liberties National Conference, Saturday 4th June 11 till 6. At Goldsmiths. There'll be people in the room that have got more details, Faisy and various others. So I'd now like to bring back Tariq to answer the questions.
The first question was, what would happen if we got out? What would change? In my opinion, not very much. So from that point of view, we have to be very clear. It's not that coming out would somehow transform Britain. That would require mass movements and an elected government. The two go together, as we know, in order to push through some measures that begin to reverse neoliberalism. The problem is that a government of that sort, let's say a Corbyn government in 2020, which wants to push through some of these things, would be hampered right from the beginning by the structures of the European Union and their laws. And someone else asked, how does that work? And it works very simply. As many people in Remain will tell you, that state help to ailing industries is forbidden. You're not allowed to do it. It breaches EU laws, and they challenge you under the competition laws that they have. It's as simple as that. Would they change it to help Corbyn out? I doubt it very much, to be perfectly frank with you. Unless you had simultaneous general strikes in France, Italy, and Spain, which would be lovely, but are not going to happen just like that. So that is what would, why we say that a number of the measures being considered by Corbyn. It's different it would have been different. Even though the pressures to privatize are tremendous, if the railways had remained nationalized, it would have been more difficult for the EU to denationalize it and insist on total privatization. What the Germans and the French, who've kept the state railway structure going, have done is to allow very tiny investment by others to keep their own rules of the EU at bay. But in Britain, the privatization was pushed through, not reversed by Blair, despite the promises before the '97 elections. And now the situation has got worse and worse and worse for taking industries back, precisely because the EU is part of a globalized capitalist machine, the European segment of it. So it wants to defend the neoliberal system and everything it stands for, as does the United States by and large, which is why the TTIP, which is being negotiated in private, will make things even worse. What, in terms of the point made by my friend in the second row, with which I'm to a certain extent sympathetic, but bringing people together is not something that is as such a function of the EU. It is the removal, you mean largely by traveling, that more people have traveled since Britain became a member of the EU. This is certainly the case, I think, especially with young people, much less so with older people, and that's been very positive. But young Norwegians, Norway is not a member of the EU. Young Swiss people, Switzerland is not a member of the EU, have exactly the same rights as traveling within the Schengen region as Britain does. Britain is not a signatory to Schengen. So you know when you leave the train station at St. Pancras, you have to show your passport. And when you come back, you have to show your passport to both Belgian or French authorities and the British system, precisely because it is not a part of Schengen. And they've been getting tougher and tougher these days, especially with non-Europeans, which they, including people from the United States. So it's not as easy as you say, and it's not as huge a problem, because I think what has already been established is going to make it very difficult to impose visas on traveling between EU and non-EU countries, as is the case at the moment. You know, you can see it when you enter the airports and train stations. What is the I mean, I think large numbers of young people are fearful of nationalism, as you are, and as I am, of particular forms, virulent forms of nationalism. But those of us who supported the right of Scotland to be independent did so not on the grounds of nationalism, but on the grounds of self-determination. And we knew also that the main nationalist party in Scotland was campaigning really for civic freedoms and not a big anti-English or anti-anything program, which is one reason they want to be part of the EU, to show they are not like that and feel that the EU will help them. They're wrong on that. So, you know, we have to discuss nationalisms. I mean, if the Iraqi people had been able to mount a national resistance, uniting Sunnis and Shias, and that division had not existed as looked likely in the first years after the occupation, would we have said we're opposed to Iraqi nationalism because they want to get the American and foreign troops out of Iraq? Not. We wouldn't have said that. But obviously, I understand your fears about nationalism, and who on the left is part of that? Sometimes you can have European nationalism too and forget Africa, South America, and Asia. Why is that any better? Often Europeans talk like that. Our civilizing mission. That is still a word used in these humanitarian wars. The civilizing mission has come back into the global vocabulary of the American empire and its allies. Thirdly, is it the case, this I say to those people who imagine that Britain will become a sovereign nation if it quits the European Union, it will in the following sense, that we will have the right, if our government does A, B, C, D, E, which we despise and dislike, the right to try and win over support, to defeat that government and replace it with a government which doesn't do those things. This is a real issue, and which will be allowed to carry through its policies without outside interference. That is possible on certain issues. It is not possible on defense, because Britain is so closely tied to the United States via NATO and via its direct links with the Pentagon and the intelligence agencies, that British sovereignty on foreign policy in these issues has been in the hands of the United States since 1957. You know, in the middle of the last century. There is no sovereignty. This is a point that the Tories, Brexit Tories, avoid because they don't like thinking about it. And this is also something that opportunist Labour types try and avoid, because they say it's not worth making a fuss about Trident or NATO. These are things for the future. They aren't, because Lindsay pointed out quite correctly that to be a member of the EU today is really to be a member of NATO, which is one reason that they rejected all the attempts by Russian leaders they liked. Both Gorbachev and Yeltsin pleaded with the West to let Russia free of its Asian parts and the Asian parts free of it. They said, we are now a European country. Why can't we join the EU? And the Americans said, well, you know, NATO. They said, we're happy to join NATO as well. Why don't you let us in? And the answer was very clear. Well, it wouldn't be right. It's too soon after the Cold War. But it's not too soon for the other Warsaw Pact countries. Basically, they didn't want a large state. And they feared a Russian-German link-up within the structures of NATO and the European Union, which could challenge American power. So they stopped that. So the notion that somehow the European Union is a gold standard for today, something we worship because it's fine and anything else would be wrong, I don't accept. And really, as someone who travels probably more in Europe than virtually any leader of the Remain campaign, I object to being told that my views are nationalist in any shape or form. Well, the things I say here, I say in Berlin, in Rome, in Madrid, in Athens, attacking against something which is a common enemy of ours. Not saying, you know, we won't collaborate with each other. Of course we will. But attacking that idea that simply being in the European Union solves problems, it doesn't solve any, which is why I took you through what is happening in every single European country at the present time. To conclude, I think these people who think fight from within are not serious, because they have absolutely no alternatives whatsoever. I think regardless of which way Britain goes, and I mean, for me there are only two strong positions. One is a sort of contemptuous abstention, which many of my friends are in favor of, and the other is for getting out. There is no third position for the left, as far as I'm concerned. But regardless of what happens, I think an initiative we could take, and when I mean we, I mean the left as a whole, after the referendum, whatever the result, is to fight for the creation and adoption of an alternative European constitution which challenges this EU constitution at Europe-wide assemblies, to begin the discussion on this and then get a document which is written down in something that we can fight for. That will be the most effective way of functioning, whatever happens in the European referendum. But in the meantime, I urge you all to vote to get out. It's the only way of administering the necessary punishment for what they have done to country after small country in the European Union. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tariq. A very good case of why we're against racist fortress Europe and why maybe another Europe is possible, but another EU is not. Now, we're